By 1916, the Eastern Front of the Great War was stuck in the mud. After 2 years of vicious back-and-forth territorial gains, the front line between the Russian Empire and the Central Powers had more or less settled into the familiar mess of trenches and barbed wire that were so iconic in the First World War. Both sides were essentially at a stalemate, unable to make any serious gains despite the heavy use of artillery. But that was all about to change. In coordination with the British and French operations in the West, Russia was preparing to launch their most ambitious plan of the entire war. An absolutely gargantuan operation involving nearly 2 million men across the Eastern Front, with the goal of not just gaining some lands, but knocking out the Austro-Hungarian army for good and crippling the Central Powers. This was the Brusilov Offensive, one of the most lethal operations in the history of mankind, and one that would change the course of the Great War. The fighting along the Eastern Front had been rather unproductive for Russia so far. Lots of men had been lost for almost nothing in return, and even the generals themselves had little optimism about a future offensive. Despite this, in February of 1916, the Russian army had launched an attack centered on Vilnius, mostly at the request of the French, who hoped that such an operation would force the Germans to divert troops away from Verdun in the west. But the attack here was, catastrophic to say the least. For every casualty that Germany suffered, Russia suffered 5. And because the Germans had been so successful in their defense, their confidence remained high after so many defensive victories, and the battle didn't do much to divert forces away from the Western Front. But this attitude was a double-edged sword. They were perhaps overconfident in the weakness of the Imperial Russian army, and so they really weren't expecting any sort of complex offensive that they wouldn't be able to easily withstand. One Austrian lieutenant colonel even said about the Russians, "They attack stupidly in thick masses. They can do no more because they have no training." With similar ideas shared even by many on Russia's side, many generals in the Imperial Russian army, such as General Alexei Evert, wanted to adopt a completely defensive posture with the goal of maintaining whatever land they had and avoid risking any more humiliating defeats on the battlefield. But one man saw everything from an entirely different perspective: General Alexei Brusilov. Brusilov believed that the Russian soldiers were capable of a successful attack as long as they had proper training, weapons, and morale. So it was Brusilov who stood up and advocated for a renewed offensive, one that would keep a previous agreement with France, Britain, and Italy to split up the strength of the Central Powers along multiple fronts. France was occupied mostly with the German attacks at Verdun, Italy in the south, and Britain was planning the massive Somme offensive for July 1916. There would never be a better time to strike in the east than while the Central Powers were divided, and Brusilov was up to the task. Despite being warned that a failed attack could ruin his reputation, he refused to back down, and eventually his plan was approved by Tsar Nicholas II. The plan involved 1.7 million men, divided into 2 fronts. In the northern sector, General Evert would advance on German defenses with the goal of reaching Vilnius. Here, they enjoyed a large numerical advantage. Just 10 days before this attack, General Brusilov in the southwestern sector would advance on the Austro-Hungarian defenses along a 450-kilometer front line in what is today part of western Ukraine. Here, a strategic city or goal wasn't as clearly defined, just the overall hope of crushing as many of the enemy as possible while creating a diversion for the attack up north. And for Brusilov's sector, it wasn't just planning to gather hundreds of thousands of men and have them charge straight into enemy territory, something that clearly wasn't working in the new era of warfare with machine guns and trenches. Traditionally, the Russians had suffered huge casualties as their men grouped together to push through breaks in the barbed wire, allowing defenders to focus their fire on relatively small areas. Brusilov intended to avoid this by having his men attack across larger fronts, spreading out the enemy's attention and allowing more opportunities to break through their lines. Then, when a break was achieved, Brusilov could flood it with reinforcements. And that wasn't all. Brusilov had also put together some interesting tactics based on what he had learned from his enemies, his allies, and Russia's past mistakes. For example, when it came to artillery, Russia's previous use of it was pretty unorganized and just overall not very effective. Under the new training, though, the artillery would be directed in coordinated movements thanks to information gathered by reconnaissance planes, who would spot crucial places where the barbed wire could be destroyed, and also vital trenches whose collapse would make it difficult for the defenders to move effectively. After this, spotters would relay the effectiveness of the strikes, and adjustments would be made as necessary. Quite a step up from simply taking aim and shooting randomly behind enemy lines. Once the artillery barrage had lifted, 4 waves of men would jump from the trenches and advance. The first 2 waves would be armed not only with their rifles, but also plenty of hand grenades to obliterate the first line of defense. Once this had been accomplished, the 3rd wave would bring in the machine guns, leading the way for the cavalry that would follow in the 4th wave to charge through the opening. All of these tactics and formations were completely foreign to both the officers and to the average Russian soldier. But this was expected. To prepare for the assault, everyone underwent extensive training. Mock battles were carried out on replicas of Austro-Hungarian defenses to simulate the upcoming battle, and secret trenches were even dug to bring the assault teams even closer to the enemies, in some places within 50 meters. The men were trained to work together as a team with individual roles, ready to improvise and adapt to any challenge on the battlefield, instead of just being a big group of men running straight into machine gun fire. Russian morale on the southwestern front had skyrocketed throughout this training, and even the officers had growing confidence in their men's abilities to emerge victorious. But on the other side of the front line, the Austro-Hungarian defenses were expecting the same old strategies, and boy, were they in for a shock. The attack date was eventually set for June 4th, 1916. A bit earlier than everyone had anticipated, but Brusilov was certain that his men were ready. It began with an immense artillery bombardment at the trenches guarding the city of Lutsk, and just as they'd trained for, the men worked to fire their 76mm guns in careful coordination at the Austro-Hungarian lines. Thanks to the spotter planes, the first rain of fire was a massive success, and 24 breaches were opened amid the tangles of barbed wire. This was then followed by the heavier artillery, pounding the strongholds in the enemy trenches, paving the way for the men that would soon be arriving. But instead of a huge attack, as the defenders were expecting, they were instead met with several touch-and-go missions, small pokes and prods into the front lines that relayed better information back to the artillery units. Then, in the evening, the order was given to charge, and waves of assault troops leapt from their trenches and began a steady walk toward the enemy lines in a formation known as a creeping barrage, where the Russian artillery would land just in front of the men as they marched forward, concealing their approach until the very last second. The Austro-Hungarian forces defending the line in front of Lutsk numbered around 200,000, while Brusilov's Russians only came in at around 150,000. But this disadvantage wasn't felt in the slightest. The first waves of assault troops crashed through the heavily defended trenches, gunning down their enemies with stunning success. In just the first day, 26,000 men were taken prisoner, with thousands more to follow in the coming days. As the Russians stormed their way through wave after wave of men, they showed no signs of stopping. They moved so quickly that captured Austro-Hungarian troops often remarked that they had no time at all to get back into their positions after an artillery strike. The moment the shells stopped falling, Russian troops were already on top of them. The Battle of Lutsk was over after just 2 days. Austria-Hungary had suffered an estimated 130,000 casualties, and while Russia had also lost thousands of men, it was nothing compared to their enemies' losses. A monumental success, to say the least. This and the coming days were such a devastating blow that Archduke Joseph Ferdinand, who'd been in command of the now almost entirely destroyed Austro-Hungarian Fourth Army, was relieved of his duties, and an Austrian commander was forced to close down his operations in Italy to divert troops and heavy guns eastward. It was exactly what Brusilov had anticipated. He just needed to keep up his momentum. And for some time he did. His men continued their march, and by June the 7th they had full control over the city of Lutsk, and they were heading for the next target, carving a salient nearly 70 kilometers deep into the front lines. Austria-Hungary attempted several counterattacks, but these were poorly planned, poorly executed, and poorly equipped. Basically, Brusilov's men were able to brush them off like mosquitoes, and Germany began diverting thousands of troops into the region to keep their ally standing. Further south, Brusilov's men had captured the city Chernivtsi, and they were now on the edge of the Carpathian Mountains, bringing in the grand possibility of marching directly into Hungary through the mountain passes. Things really couldn't have gone any better. Success on this scale was so rare in the First World War, where most front lines had been static for years, but Brusilov's innovative ideas had made his army a force to be reckoned with. And remember, this was only the first act of the show. The main push was coming just a few days later, under General Evert further north. Perhaps the Central Powers were about to suffer a major and catastrophic defeat. But this is when things started to go awry. A frustrated Brusilov was suddenly informed that Evert's main offensive further north up the front line would be delayed, as he didn't believe his men were trained enough. Or it was the bad weather, or the strong German defenses. Evert seemed to have a lot of excuses, and it was clear that he didn't have the same confidence in an offensive, or he was just scared that his reputation would suffer when he couldn't match the success that had been laid out before him. Whatever his reason, Evert requested a delay until June the 18th, and this eventually got pushed all the way to July the 3rd. But time was of the essence. They couldn't sit around all summer and allow Germany to consolidate their defenses and patch up Austria-Hungary's army. They needed to capitalize on their momentum, so Tsar Nicholas II decided to switch up the plan. Instead of Evert's attack in the north, Brusilov's already successful push would now be the main offensive, and scores of reserves were sent to continue the advance in the region. Brusilov was beside himself. He hadn't planned for this, and he wasn't sure how it would end. He was furious at the other generals for ignoring his success, and he felt that the opportunity for a decisive victory was slipping away. Regardless, he knew he would try his best, so he hastily drew up some new plans for what was now the main attack under his command. The new plan was to push forward to the city of Koval, then advance further north and capture the city of Baranvichy in modern-day Belarus. Both of these cities had vital railway junctions, which could act as the arteries of the Russian army and allow them to pump their resources even further west, where the city of Lviv was ripe for the taking. But just as Brusilov had anticipated, these delays had given Germany crucial days to send reinforcements, and the front lines became harder and harder to break through. Russian casualties began stacking up, and though they were still making progress, the loss of life was getting extreme. Another problem was that German counterattacks were much more well-organized than those of the Austro-Hungarian armies, forcing Russian units to waste crucial manpower and ammunition, and oftentimes losing the ground they had just gained. Finally, as the beginning of July arrived, General Evert was ready to launch his double-delayed attack in the north. But this was doomed from the start. Much to Brusilov's dismay, Evert had trained his men in the old Russian tactics. You know, the ones that definitely didn't work. And surprise, surprise, they didn't work. Evert launched a massive full frontal assault, losing nearly 100,000 men and gaining almost no land in return. Even Brusilov's field officers were beginning to abandon his tactics as well. They had seen how effective they were, but again, time was of the essence, and they didn't have weeks of free time to train the reservists that were arriving by the thousands every day. When they finally reached Koval, they too ordered a full frontal assault, taking immense casualties and losing the chance to take the city. As German counterattacks began striking with considerable force, Russia decided it was best to fortify the land that they'd taken and cement the new front line. Sporadic fighting raged on, of course, but without much to show. Even in the south, where Russians managed another breakthrough, they found no strategic target to claim a serious victory. Just fields, mountains, and small villages, nothing to make a new anchor for the front line. As one historian put it, attacks continued on until the autumn rains turned the roads to mud, but other than add to the already terrible casualty list, nothing was achieved. By late September, the Brusilov Offensive was over. The Brusilov Offensive ended with some mixed results, so let's start with the good ones. The attack had decimated Austria-Hungary's morale and much of their fighting force. This was such a huge defeat that they never truly recovered from it, and Germany had to pick up their slack for the remainder of the war. In total, the Central Powers had suffered nearly 1 million casualties between deaths, injuries, and prisoners of war, a number so big you can't just replace it with a quick round of fresh conscripts. It's regarded as Russia's greatest victory of the war, and perhaps one of the greatest victories of all countries involved, as it had finally shown that trenches could be taken. No man's land wasn't simply a death trap, and the stalemate could be broken. Its success even convinced Romania to join the war against the Central Powers, further surrounding Austria-Hungary and extending the front line southward. It had also technically achieved its original goal, draw the Central Powers' strength away from Verdun. Throughout the course of the offensive, Germany and Austria-Hungary diverted 30 divisions of men eastward, likely contributing to the eventual French victory at Verdun. But at the same time, many consider it a Pyrrhic victory. Russian casualties also neared 1 million men, which included a lot of experienced veteran soldiers. Russia's offensive capabilities would never recover. But again, this isn't really Brusilov's fault. He was only intending his part of the offensive to be a diversion before the main attack, so perhaps things would have gone better if Evert had followed his example in the north instead of sticking to the old playbook. And in some respects, it actually made the Central Powers a little stronger. After seeing how terribly the Austro-Hungarian forces had held their ground, Germany assumed command over many of their armies, hoping to bring them up to par. And Brusilov's tactics are believed to have inspired the emergence of German stormtroopers later in the war who adopted similar tactics on the Western Front. While the battles may have failed to achieve a decisive victory in the Eastern Front, there's one place where the offensive certainly had a massive influence: back home in Russia. The immense loss of life and the palpable incompetence of the country's leadership angered many. And there is no doubt that the inconclusive result of these offensives contributed to the onset of the Russian Revolution. With the growing unrest back home, Russia would eventually be forced to withdraw from the conflict to focus on the Russian Civil War. Brusilov himself would eventually fight for the Bolsheviks, after which he would find himself a crucial part in the founding of the Soviet Red Army. So, who knows? If Evert had cooperated with his northern half of the attack and been successful, maybe the population of the Russian Empire would have felt more compelled to support the war effort, and perhaps the revolution wouldn't have gained so much traction as it did, never giving rise to the Soviet Union. If this single offensive had gone just a little differently, we could be living in a really different world today.